Hi all, Dr. Clark here again, and today for Natural Resources we're going to discuss non-renewable energy sources. Okay? And before I get into this, I just want to let you know that this is just data. This is just analysis. Okay? There's no feeling in this. I know that some of you work for the oil fields or work for coal or have family members that do. I'm not trying to take jobs away from anyone or nothing like that. I'm just presenting you the actual data, the actual scientific information from these pieces. Now, with that being said, some of this will or may piss you off, and you may find or think that I'm wrong. You're more than welcome to post or send me an email that says, hey, here's a different scientific source, and I'll utilize that. But if you're sending me information that's from a news group or from a Facebook page or from your buddy, I'm not going to utilize that information because that's not science. Okay? And this is a scientific course, at least portion of it is. And so we're going to analyze it from that point of view. Most of the information that you'll see actually comes directly from oil and coal companies as they report how much they utilize or how much they have left or how they take it from the planet. Okay? The same thing goes for wind and solar when we get to renewable energy sources. Again, I am just presenting the scientific information. I'm not on one side or the other. Okay? And I just present what the data shows. Alright, so that being said, we're going to start off by looking at a map here of the United States. And these are non-renewable energy sources or energy power plants. And this is where they're located. And it's based on how much energy is generated, how much megawatts per hour is generated. So if it's yellow, that means it's kicking out a lot of megawatts. You can see Jim Bridger power plant is in yellow in Wyoming, so it's kicking out a lot of energy in that region. Now, you might say, wow, this is crazy to think that the western part of the United States doesn't have much energy, but mind you, this is non-renewable energy sources. This is going to be coal, oil, natural gas, those kind of things. The majority of the western United States, I shouldn't say the majority, but a good portion of it is on renewable energy sources, whether that be Washington, Oregon, Idaho. Majority of their power is coming from hydro, with California, Arizona, Nevada having much larger pieces coming from things like solar and in some cases wind. So that's where a lot of that discrepancy comes. Those are not included on this map. So most of the eastern United States is powered by oil, gas, and coal, and most of the western United States not so much. And we'll come back and we'll look at this and we'll look at a renewable energy source and you can see the switch. Alright, so let's jump into what it means to be renewable or non-renewable. Okay, so a non-renewable energy source is just one that its reserves are used up faster than you can replenish them. So coal, oil, natural gas, we use those energy sources faster than they can be made. Okay? It takes roughly 300 million years for plants or animal tissue and things like that under high pressure and the right soil conditions to become oil, natural gas, or coal. And we're not waiting 300 million years. It's not going to occur. So we utilize it faster than it can be replenished. Okay? A renewable energy source is one that can replenish itself continuously. and doesn't run out, okay? Or at least in the foreseeable future does not run out. So it's renewable in the sense that it's a continuous energy that is replenishing its reserves. Okay, and we'll come back to reserves and things like that. So these would include things like solar, geothermal, tidal, wind. There's quite a few different ones that you can look at. So we'll come back to renewable, but first I just want to talk a little bit about renewable in the sense that about 20% of the world's energy comes from renewable resources. Now, a lot of that will come into play. We'll look at, what different countries have. Like, for example, the United States is, I think, around 11% of our energy comes from renewable resources. But there are some countries that are completely renewable. Albania, Iceland, Paraguay, Norway. Costa Rica's at 99%, Sweden's at 99%. So some of these countries are really close, or they're already at 100% renewable. Costa Rica is an interesting situation. They went what we would consider all in, and they did so in 2014. Okay? They decided to go 100% renewable as fast as they could, and they pretty much did it in 4 years. So they made the switch in about 4 years to 100% renewable. So we're going to watch a little video about other countries that are utilizing some of the renewable energy sources that you don't often hear too much about, like geothermal.
The heavy machinery at this tyre retreading shop in Nairobi uses a lot of electricity. And while everything's working smoothly now, Philip Jenga knows he may at any time suffer another power blackout.
When you don't have electricity, we use the generator.
That's an extra cost to his company of around $400 a month in diesel. But the number of power blackouts has gone down recently, so too has his electricity bill.
I can say the bill has come down with about 15 to 20%.
That's because of a gradual upgrade of lines and infrastructure and an injection of power from harnessing the Great Rift Valley's vast geothermal resources. Hot, high-pressure natural energy bursting up from deep underground.
The people who are getting electricity in this country are less than, is about a quarter of the population. And if we can develop all the geothermal resource, then we can give almost 100% of the population. That means even the guy in the rural areas will get energy.
The geothermal that's been added to the power grid has already saved the country millions of dollars in diesel, which had been relied upon heavily to help bolster the power supply. Around 70% of Kenya's energy comes from renewable sources. The government's investing heavily to try and increase that further.
The country's development is dependent on the energy development. If you have energy available, then you have every reason to bring industrialists around and develop industrially.
And that's the aim. The government wants to turn Kenya into more of an attractive prospect for foreign investors and big business. But Jeff Maragi, who oversees the energy sector at the Association of Manufacturers, says there's still some way to go.
There's some progress in the sector. There's a lot of genuine government effort towards improving the energy situation in the country, but I think over time there has to be a concerted effort towards ensuring that we have cheaper, better quality power in the long term.
To be able to put the tire.
In the short term, Philip at least has noticed fewer blackouts and less money spent on running the generator. That's already meant more reliable tyre production and a little more profit. Erica Wood, Al Jazeera, Nairobi.
Okay, so there you can see a video on places like Kenya, which are trying to use things that maybe have been ignored in the past. Geothermal energy was never really harvested by, at least in the African continent never really harvested for an energy source like that. And this is renewable as long as there's magma on the planet. Then you'll have these geothermal vents, and you can have a renewable resource constantly for this. And it's making, their connection to oil, natural gas, and carbon less of a burden on the country, because in most of those regions in Kenya there is no oil, natural gas, coal, so they don't have to import material in and spend money, so it's saving them a lot of money. This is the case in a lot of energy sources. If you use the energy source that's currently in your backyard, you'll probably save yourself some money. But regardless of that, we're going to start to talk about these non-renewable energy sources, right, and the benefits that can come from them and the costs that might come from them. Okay? So this is going to be a cost-benefit analysis of non-renewable energy sources. All right, so first, when we start talking about resources, we need to talk about what we would consider reserves, resources, and then kind of the economics behind that. So a resource is any kind of natural occurring substance that humans, because we're talking about us here, can utilize with the current technology that they have. Now, that doesn't mean that there are not potential resources that we don't have technology to obtain, and there's probably lots of those. Okay? We're not going to talk about the potential for things, mainly because it's not known, or maybe it's hypothesized, but at least not well known. Okay? The well-known information is the reserves. So how much of a deposit do you have in a certain region? Okay, so if we look at this graph here, the undiscovered but thought to exist piece could be really big for a region, but because it still hasn't been discovered, it's meaningless. Okay? It also could be hypothesized that it's really big, but then when we get around to it, you have to realize that our current technology cannot remove that. Okay? So either technology has to advance, or we just have to leave it alone. Okay? There is some that we've identified, okay, and it's not economical at the time. Either the current technology is not good, or the economics behind that identified resource is poor. No one needs it. Okay? And there's lots of situations with this in non-renewable resources where there's little teeny pockets of oil or natural gas in a region, but you would have to drill so many holes to obtain it, or connect those holes in some kind of way to obtain enough to make any economic profit, that by the time you did it, you would have no profit. And so remember, a lot of this resource reserve is around profit for a country, for a business, for an individual, and there is a profit curve. And that profit curve, from a cost-benefit analysis, would be that the cost is less than the benefit. From an environmental cost-benefit analysis, it might be something a little bit different, and we can talk about that later. Okay? So there's going to be a piece of this pie, no matter what the resource is, okay, that we have reserves. Especially for a non-renewable resource, you have to talk about the reserves, because no new resource is being created in the time of extraction. And so we talk about reserves. When we talk about renewable resources, we don't talk about reserves because it's a continuous process. Okay? So these reserves, the further you slide this way, the more reserves you have, the greater the piece of the pie, the higher the profit for that country or whatever we're talking about, business, individual. All right, so let's look at fossil fuels, and we'll talk about coal just in general. And so this is going to be a general overview of the fossil fuels that we utilize in the United States and worldwide. And then I'll dive in to each one of the fossil fuels more in depth in future lectures. So the first one, let's talk about coal. So coal is, like I said before, about 300 million years for coal to form, and you get plant material that has died on the landscape and it gets buried underwater. And so regions where there's lots of coal, big coal veins, you know there was either ancient oceans there, ancient estuaries, or big lakes that had, that were shallow, that had plants growing in them, or the landscape was flooded and that's what killed the plants, and then they died and resided underneath the water. Okay, but it really has to do with water, because you have to have the pressure from the water to exert on this plant material that's going to be decomposing. All right, so whatever the cause is, whatever the water source is, sediment will most likely be covering those plant materials, and it has to in order for coal to form. Sediment will cover the plant material, okay? And that'll create pressure and a different temperature profile. So you get pressure from the water, you get pressure from the sediment, and you lock in that carbon, okay, that was found in the tissue of the organism. And then over time, as long as the pressure is consistent and the heat is consistent, you can get the transformation of organic matter, so rotting flesh, okay, which we often call peat, okay, into coal. And depending on the time, the pressure, the temperature, gives you different coal profiles, different types of coal. Okay? And this is really the different types of coal, and we'll talk about them in a second, or maybe next lecture. But the different types of coal is really around how much water content they have in the coal. Okay? A coal that's got a lot of water content is not very good for like burning and getting energy off of it, but that's probably more likely the coal that you're going to find is one that's got some kind of water content in it, depending on the region. Okay. So if we look at the coal reserves, this is as of 2012, and so this is the reason why I'm showing you 2012 is because you'll see a drastic change when we start looking at things. And for 2012, that's not too long ago. Most of you remember 6 years ago. So it's easy to kind of look at a 6-year period or a 10-year period. And some of these I'll look at a 10-year period. But 6-year period here. The world reserves is about 860,000 million metric tons of coal. And the United States, which has quite a bit of coal, and we probably have the third most amount of coal per continent, and we have roughly 245,000 million metric tons of that is of 2012. Okay, these are reserves, so this is known coal that we can remove. Okay, so remember, the reserve is already known, it's already classified, it's already we know where it's at, and our current technology can get to it. Doesn't mean that we've already dug a pit around it, doesn't mean we've already taken a skim off the mountain to find it, but we know where it's at and we know our technology can get to it. That's where the reserve comes in. Alright? Now at our current rate of extraction and utilization, we remove about 4% of the reserve per year. Right? And we've been doing that since 2012, okay, at kind of the same rate. Coal's been pretty constant. I'll show you a figure. At least in the United States, it's been pretty constant. But worldwide, about 4% is utilized per year. So here you can see the United States consumption of coal. Okay? And this is going from 1950 to 2017. And you can see that we really ramped it up in the 90s and into the early 2000s, and then started decreasing over the last roughly six years. Okay, the high point was about 2007, where we were consuming 1,000 million, a little over 1,000 million metric tons. Okay, and so that's where the 4% comes in. Now let's say, we're looking at the United States, and you can see that we're trickling off. Our utilization of coal is down. Okay, it's not quite down by half, but 700 million tons versus 1,100 or 1,050 million tons, somewhere in that region. Okay, so we've dropped quite a bit, and if you look at 2018, it's almost identical to 2017. Okay. Now, during that time period, though, this is showing kind of the reverse. So in 2000, China was consuming about 1,000 million metric tons. Okay. And now China in 2017, and probably even in 2018, it's going to be pretty close to this, is consuming 3,000 million tons. Okay, over 3 times what the United States consumed during its peak as what China is consuming. Okay, so even though we might say we're consuming 4%, okay, but the United States is trickling down and we're consuming less of that reserve. So remember, if you're taking 4% of the world reserve, all the countries are utilizing 4%, that's only going to last so long. Okay? 4% every single year, you're going to run out of percent pretty soon. So a lot of people have said, well, our reserves should last a lot longer because we're utilizing less in the United States. This is true, but when other countries, China, India, they're utilizing our portion of that percent. We might be reducing our portion, but they're going to take that portion in, and they're utilizing it. And you can easily see that they're 3 times the amount of energy consumption or coal consumption than the United States. So I guess I'll talk about different kinds of coal now. I thought this was during the coal lecture, but nonetheless, we'll probably come back in. So peat, again, is kind of rotting material, rotting flesh of typically plants, things that are high in carbon. And so you want these long carbon chains that are present in things like cellulose and different kinds of glucose and stuff like that, different carbohydrates. And when that starts to rot under pressure, you can get the formation of lignite, and then sub-bituminous and bituminous and anthracite, and these are different types of coal. Again, they're all carbon based, but it's a different type of coal, and it's based on mainly the moisture that's found within them. Okay? The other thing that it can be classified is different types of components. So how much of it is it just fixed carbon, and how much of it is these other volatile compounds or components. Okay? The more components you have, the less pure the coal is. Okay? So peat is really just rotting flesh. It's not coal. It's not fixed carbon at all. Okay? But it will eventually turn into it if given the right conditions, the right temperature, the right pressure, that kind of stuff. Okay? Then you get lignite, which is kind of a very poor coal. It has a lot of water in it, high moisture, doesn't burn very well, it doesn't create a lot of energy, also has a lot of secondary compounds or components in it. Sub-bituminous, again, less water, but still a lot of components that are not fixed carbon. Bituminous, this is probably the one that we're after the most often. because it's fairly good. There's fairly low moisture, there's less volatile components, and there's more fixed carbon. The one we always want is anthracite, but it's very, I don't want to say it's very rare, but it's a very, very small portion of the coal on the planet is in this form. This is utilized for very special projects, very kind of special kind of coal, and these are probably, these two, sub-bituminous and bituminous, are what we use to run power plants and things like that. Lignite a little bit, but it's kind of a poor coal. All right, let's talk about oil and natural gas a little bit here. Okay, so instead of having that connection to plant material, oil and natural gas most likely came from microscopic marine organisms. And you can see evidence of this if you worked for, or you know people that work for natural gas companies or oil companies for that matter. When they drill a core and to drill the well and they pull that core out, and I used to work for a natural gas company, and so if you look at that core, a lot of times it's just loaded with fossils. Fossils of normally shelled organisms, so clams and snails and things like that. And so that's probably where the evidence comes from, that this is just carbon that's coming from living microorganisms that's getting compressed. They die, they get compressed into these pockets of oil and natural gas. Same kind of process that you would see from the plant community, except for this is probably just occurring in naturally occurring oceans, and those micro marine organisms are dying, they're going to the bottom, they get covered in sediment, and more pressure and more heat near the heat vents and things like that occur, and that's why our oceans have a fair amount of oil and natural gas that is probably under the ocean floor, okay? And that's why companies want to drill there. So another, just more based on the formation of this, is really just based the same kind of premise as you would see in the formation of coal. Again, you just get different types of rocks are better at containing coal, so things like shale is good at containing, sorry, not coal, containing oil and natural gas for that matter. And the two are linked often, and that's why you can see in different states, Texas, Wyoming, portions of Colorado, where there might be an old oil field where people had actually had oil rigs on it, now often will have natural gas rigs on it, because natural gas normally occurs above the oil region, and we used to just burn the natural gas off or let it seep out so we could get to the oil, and then we realized that natural gas is actually highly beneficial and can be utilized for a lot of energetic needs, and now we utilize it a lot more. In fact, there's a lot of research out there that suggests that natural gas, the use of natural gas, is why the coal industry is actually dying in the United States, because natural gas is obtained easier, it's cleaner, it burns cleaner, and it provides a lot of kilowatts. And so regardless of that, natural gas occurs at the top layer of oil. So you can see here changes in oil reserves over really the last 25 years. You can see that in the 80s, or in 1980, we're using about 700 billion barrels of oil, and now today, well, we're using more than this, but today we're using about 1,700 billion barrels of oil in a year. So it's a huge change. We're ramping it up, and we'll see what that means for reserves. So again, back to that kind of crude oil, natural gas deposits. Okay, it all really resides around what was that region at one time. Okay? Often, if you're in regions where it was an old lake, okay, like Lake Agassiz, different regions where there is a lot of water, you can get these deposits that happen. Not just coal, but you can also get these deposits of gas and oil. Also, if the oceans were much higher and the ocean was mainland, which is now what we would consider mainland, you could have those, deposits occurring mainland instead of an old lake bed. It was actually marine environment that caused those deposits, and the ocean swells and reduces, and it has for 4 billion years or so. It's consumed landscapes and resided and allowed a landscape to come out of the ocean. With that, okay, a lot of those deposits would occur. So you can see here we'll have an impermeable cap. So this is a kind of a hard bedrock material that doesn't allow for leaching, and so that will keep the gas formation and the oil from being there. And remember that oil doesn't mix with water. Oil will reside on top of water, so often you'll have the gas layer first, then you'll have an oil layer, and then you'll have a water layer. Now this can occur in many different pockets because this is showing this permeable or impermeable cap, kind of just making this mound or whatever. But if you really notice this, you might have an impermeable cap that dredges down, causes a little pocket that can form oil and natural gas, and then it might ridge back up and form another pocket, and back and forth. So you can get these little pockets, and that's why you don't just need one well. You might need a bunch of wells, or you might need to drill a directional well, so it's not a straight line down, but rather it's coming at an angle to hit into that natural gas and oil. All right, so let's look at some of these. So these are the world oil reserves of during 2012. You can see the oil reserve for the United States is about 220 billion barrels of oil. For the world, about 1,668 billions of barrels of oil. And so that was what was known in 2012, known that we could get at it with our current equipment, current technology. The amount found in reserves could have increased since then. Our technology has increased, but we're also utilizing a huge amount of this, and I'll talk about that in a second. Okay, the world natural gas reserve, that should say 2012, not 2,102. But that is, in the United States, okay, we're looking at about 10 trillion cubic meters. Okay, worldwide, we're looking at about 187 trillion cubic meters. So we have less kind of natural gas than some of the other regions of the world, but nonetheless, we still have quite a bit. Okay, so what does that mean? So here's the daily oil consumption of the United States since 1998. Okay, so 1998 to 2017, you can pretty much see that it's a pretty straight line. We are pretty flatlined when it comes to consumption of oil over this period. And there's a few high peaks, a little bit of low peak, and then a couple risers, but nonetheless, we're spending or utilizing about 20,000 barrels of oil per day. Okay? So what does that amount to? Per year, we spend about 7 billion. So hold on. This is 20,000 barrels of oil. Okay? So it's about 19 million barrels of oil per day. Sorry. And so over a year, that amounts to about 7 billion. 19 million times 365, about 7 billion barrels of oil per year. So if we were to look at the United States reserve, under the current consumption of 2017, okay, so 2017, 2018, under that current consumption, if we were to just say no more oil from outside resources, we're just using the oil in the United States, okay, under that current consumption, we'd be done with our oil reserves in 24 years. Okay. The estimates suggest that if we use the current consumption of the world and we utilize the reserves that are known today, that the world will run out of oil in about 50 years. Okay, so if we used ours and just the United States could use our oil, we'd be done in 24. Okay, but if the whole world uses what we know in the world, we'll be done in 50. Okay. Right now, like I said before, 20% of the world is renewable resources and 80% of the world's energy is coming from non-renewable resources, which mainly comes in the form of fossil fuels. Okay. So next topic, I'm going to talk more in depth about coal, the coal industry, how coal is extracted, and kind of, you know, the benefits of coal, the price of coal, and what is, you know, what's going on in the coal industry today. And then we'll talk about oil and natural gas, and then we'll talk about nuclear, and on and on and on. So we'll cover quite a few non-renewable resources, and then we'll go into the renewable resources, so you kind of have both pieces of the pie. All right, next time, oil.